they're exquisite, and her detail, and particularly she was about the Atlantic and the Atlantic coast, and would do her research from Key West, Florida to Beaufort, North Carolina, and then spent her summers in Maine. And she worked at U.S. Fish and Wildlife in Washington, D.C., and had a small house that we're trying to save right now, Silver Spring, Maryland. And she became the most popular ocean writer. In this period after World War II, her books became just giant hits. If I get a book on the bestseller list 3 weeks, I'm happy. She was on like 67 weeks, 78 weeks, 100 weeks. I mean, it's like insane. It's just, and at that same time, Jacques Cousteau was starting to talk about about ocean studies. But she also was opposed to nuclear testing on environmental and ecological and humanitarian grounds, but was quiet about it. But she was really upset about the studies being conducted on the spraying of DDT. DDT is like the atomic bomb, another miracle of science that was really developed in a mass way to help us win the war. I mean, my 3 presidents in my book, Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon, were all sprayed with DDT. If you went to the Pacific, you couldn't wait to get sprayed down with DDT because you didn't want malaria. You don't want ticks. You don't want mosquitoes, illnesses. And so, it was popular, and it got adopted in the war by Big Ag, the agricultural conglomerate, agro-business, however you want to call it, as a modern miracle. They used to say, presto, Aladdin's lamp, the biggest new miracle is DDT. Because they would mass crop spray it, and it would kill the insects, and it was proving to be the dream come true for large-scale agriculture. And Carson, however, working in U.S. Fish and Wildlife, they were doing, we have a place that we all own, guys, called Pawtuxet, Maryland. It's a wildlife research center. And as I'm speaking to you, they are testing chemicals on animals, on what happens if you dump water into a estuary. You dump poisons into an estuary. How does this fish deal with it? How are the breeding of an eagle or a robin deal with it? They're doing all of these to help us, studying animal life and see how much we can absorb in our skins, how much till you have a product that's in crisis. Well, they found that DDT was bad, that it should not, at least unregulated. These are just chemicals just being sprayed and dumped. And Rachel Carson wrote an article in 1945 with the war going on, with everybody loving DDT, and couldn't get it published, which was saying DDT is a poison and is lethal. And at least, she didn't call for a ban, so it needs further study before we're doing this mass application because of cancer, leukemia, etc. Concerns. Because she couldn't get it published, she kind of gave up the ghost about it. She became too big a writer, best-selling, winning every award. But by the late 1950s, she got awakened again about DDT because how many of here remember the name Dr. Benjamin Spock? Wow, it means we're an older audience. But Dr. Spock, the baby doctor, his sister Marjorie Spock, lived out here in Suffolk County, Long Island. And Marjorie Spock had a large organic farm. Now today, where there's a Whole Foods everywhere and many people want organic food, chemicals out of their food, it's not weird. But back then it was kind of weird that she was totally against, the chemicals in the food. So, but she wanted to grow produce fairly enough that weren't sprayed with the DDT. Yet Suffolk County, New York, U.S. Department of Agriculture were crop spraying all over Long Island. And Marjorie Spock sues that Suffolk County and the federal government are taking away my living. I can no longer be an organic farmer. who gave them the right to spray chemicals over my house, over my property? So no matter what, you can see it's an interesting case. And I mean, it went, and of course it went to the Supreme Court. And it became high profile. And Marjorie Spock loses. But when she lost, William O. Douglas from Yakima, Washington, the ardent environmental Supreme Court justice, wrote a brilliant dissent saying that she is getting her constitutional right taken away to being an organic farmer. And it created a brouhaha. And all of Marjorie Spock's, Supreme Court cases, how much legal work gets ginned up, stacks of it, all of that legal work, plus all of the work that she had acquired and was acquiring from U.S. Fish and Wildlife. She combined them both and wrote the book Silent Spring. And she wrote it in the late 50s, and it comes out in 1962. She was dying of breast cancer. She had metastasized. She had gone to Mayo. She'd gone to Cleveland Clinic, Hopkins. She lost all of her hair. She would wear a wig and was trying to finish this warning about DDT before she died. When she finished it in early '62, William O. Douglas was her first big reader, and Douglas was extremely close to John F. Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy and the entire Kennedy family. He was like an adjunct member of the Kennedys. What we used to call Old Man Joe Kennedy, JFK and RFK's father, was a Republican at heart. And he said, I don't know what's wrong with me. The only two men in public life I like are Bill Douglas and my son Jack, and they're both crazy. I don't agree with them on anything, but they're the two best people I know. And Douglas taught the Kennedy kids about the outdoor life, so much so that he took Robert F. Kennedy to go to Siberia to go hiking and all over Siberia. And when Bobby Kennedy got 104 fever on the trail, he left him in a little hut to Bill Douglas, put on his backpack and said, "Good luck, Bobby, this is where we part." And Ethel Kennedy told me, the wife, that she was livid for about a decade about what Bill Kennedy did, left her husband to die. But Bobby saw it as part of a strenuous life. Theodore Roosevelt, Amazon, expedition, men, there's a machoism to it, and I had to, the trail calls me, goodbye, I hope you make it type of attitude. But Douglas was this much of a wild card. I mean, in the 50s, he hiked 186 miles from Georgetown to Cumberland, Maryland, to stop a road from being built, and he stopped it. And when he saved the C&O Canal, which is now a national park along the Potomac, that victory is all he needed. He went and hiked the coast of Washington State and stopped a road from being built along the beach there. He went to Kentucky and stopped a dam that would have ruined this great gorge area there, with a young Wendell Berry writing about it before he became a famous literary figure. He went to Buffalo River in Arkansas, and people were to save this wild river, undammed in Arkansas. Douglas went canoeing, Supreme Court justice, and people put barbed wire across the river. They would fire at kayakers and canoers in his party. It was like a war to save the Buffalo River down there, and Douglas won that one. He won, I'm not kidding you, he's like 24 for 24 on his stunts to protest. And one reason he was successful is the whole Kennedy machine was behind Bill Douglas, what he was doing. So when Douglas read Rachel Carson, he immediately said, when he read Silent Spring, she is our Harriet Beecher Stowe. Just like Harriet Beecher Stowe was warning about the slavery and the need for abolition, or just like Thomas Paine did Common Sense at the American Revolution, or just like in Theodore Roosevelt's era tweet, The Jungle by Upton Sinclair about meatpacking. It's rarely does a book have this kind of galvanizing effect where you can feel the tectonic plate shift. Something in society shifts. And the shift is expanding on Theodore Roosevelt and FDR, who are doing a lot of preservation and scientific work. But what she expanded the audience, if you like, was she said to you and you and you, your children can be getting sick playing in the backyard. You know, I was just by Hofstra, Eisenhower Park there. You can go in that park, if they're spraying chemicals there and you're laying in the grass and you fall asleep and your child could be getting sick. If you fall into a river, your child it could die because there's so much toxicity in the water. Well, that is a good way to expand the conservation movement. You know? Those aren't people that are looking to go to Devil's Tower, Wyoming, or to, you know, go rafting down the Rio Grande River. These are people all around us are saying, whoa, by the way, what are these chemicals? And, you know, and when her book came out, it got serialized in the New Yorker, and it just created a firestorm. And they tried, and look, the chemical conglomerates combined are very powerful. People often will use the word the oil and gas lobby. Well, you want to look into the chemical lobby sometime. And now a lone woman with cancer at a small house whose most money she ever made was a little bit on book advances is wants to have the U.S. government force every chemical to get analyzed, whether it's harmful effects. You could see why the chemical industry would be worried. One thing about private sector, they do not like federal regulators. And John F. Kennedy, quite bravely, at a podium, when asked about Rachel Carson, said, look, I know all about it. I'm like you, read her. And we're now going to put a panel of scientists together and find out whether she's right or not. That was the right thing for president to do. And it turned out the panel said, yes, Rachel Carson was correct. DDT was killing all the eagles, it was killing fish, it was thinning of eggs of birds, and it had negative cluster effects for America. So you might say, well, what do you mean? How do you, I will tell you, you know where they heavily spray DDT and other types of pesticides in that general genre? Plains, Georgia, where President Jimmy Carter is now suffering on hospice. Do you realize that Jimmy Carter has the second longest military career of any president of the 20th century outside of Dwight Eisenhower? We forget that Carter's a military guy, but he grew up in Little Plains, agribusiness, his dad a peanut cotton, but he went to a Naval Academy. And then he went and lived everywhere. He had a child born in Connecticut, and one born in Virginia Beach, and one born in Hawaii, and he was a military guy. And he left Georgia from he was not there from 45 to 1954 when they were blanket spraying, undiluted, the pesticides. You know who was there in Little Plains? His mother, who dies of pancreatic cancer. His father, who dies of pancreatic cancer. His brother Billy, who dies of pancreatic cancer. His sister Ruth, who dies of pancreatic cancer. His sister Gloria, who dies of pancreatic cancer. It was a contamination zone. And I'm just picking because he's famous and is a president, one area of Georgia. But this happening around the country. And yet, it became, Rachel Carson was racing against the clock. And of course, John F. Kennedy will soon be killed. But the reason Carson's important for the Kennedy world is both Rachel Carson and Kennedy teamed up on seashore preservation. What you guys are trying to do in the Oyster Bay here, and what you're doing on Long Island, of preservation, wetlands, conservation. But they started, Kennedy saved Cape Cod National Seashore, Point Reyes in California, which is the most beautiful part of the land right by the Golden Gate Bridge. Padre Island, Texas, which is a massive beach, all for undeveloped protection zones as national seashores. And then they said, what about lake shores? And under Kennedy and Johnson, we saved the Indiana Dunes by Indiana, Sleeping Bear Dunes by in Michigan, Picture Rock, Michigan, the Apostle Islands, Wisconsin. Point is, we were saving shoreline. Fire Island. Yeah, Fire Island. Lyndon Johnson got Fire Island done. Same period. Thank you. And I write about that a lot in the book. In fact, the Fire Island one was went against Robert Moses like this, and it was grassroots people, Long Island, saying no, we're going to save some of the shoreline, and it became, these are big fights, guys. They're not like light. It's real like intense. Each one, you can laundry list them. Each is a big conservation battle, and so that's going on, and that's part of Carson and Kennedy's seashore legacy. Kennedy's great poet love was Robert Frost, and it was the great friend of the Kennedy White House, Frost. He spoke at Kennedy's inaugural, and he was Stuart Udall, the Interior Secretary's close friend. So the arts were getting into the environment, early 60s. But when Kennedy dies in November of 63, in early 64, Rachel Carson dies. And there's this moment where there's all, like Udall at Interior said, Kennedy opened the door and all these conservationists came rushing in. But what's Lyndon gonna do? Nobody knew, because Lyndon Johnson had been opposed to the seashore protections as a senator. He was for development. He was for the Jerseyization of seashore commercial developments. And was not part of the list of people thought of LBJ as a conservationist. But he was a rancher, and he had his own Walden Pond. You know, Henry David Thoreau wrote Walden. And you all know Oyster Bay here was Theodore Roosevelt's haven. If everywhere he went, this was where he wanted to be. Jack Kennedy, truly, more than I knew when I began this, had a love of the ocean and Cape Cod. And it was hard to save Cape Cod National Seashore because cities like Truro and Chapman and Provincetown, this is not saving a bit of the Brooks Range in Alaska. This was heavy duty work. And Johnson ended up having a Walden, and that was the Pedernales River of Texas. And so if you go there today, his ranch is there. Because you live in New York, there's no reason you would think about the Pedernales. But so you have to trust me. It's a beautiful river. A lot of swimming holes, and there's the Edwards Aquifer that comes up around there. And so it's kind of a magical waterscape where you can see the bottom and it's clear. Even today, it's remarkably beautiful river. And that's where he loved his ranch. And he married an environmentalist, Lady Bird Johnson. She grew up near the Big Thicket, Texas-Louisiana border, and loved the flora and fauna. Her diaries as First Lady about the natural world are remarkable. And she's the one who nudges Lyndon to go progressive on environmental protection in the 60s more than anybody else. So the combo of the two, the Johnsons do a lot. Fire Island, he just mentioned one, Assateague, Maryland, seashore in Maryland, Virginia. The movement to Cumberland Island, Georgia starts. But the big ones of LBJ are some of the national parks they create. Last of the gems of our system, Canyonlands National Park in Utah, the North Cascades in Washington State, which is a stupendously beautiful park. The Redwood National Park in California, and that was Lady Bird going hard on redwoods in the 1960s. But Lyndon Johnson had changed. He had read a book called Goodbye to a River by a man named John Graves, and it's about a Texas river, the Blanco, that got dammed and ruined forever, over industrialized, over channelized. And this guy, before the Army Corps, Bureau of Reclamation was coming to build the dam, this writer, John Graves, took a journey down the river before he says goodbye to it. A nice piece of conservation writing. And Johnson, who didn't read that much, he's no TR, he's not a Jack Kennedy either in this regard. He read very well Steinbeck and certain writers he liked, Johnson. But he bought into the idea that we needed to save wild and pristine rivers, and he signs the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. So we have beautiful rivers in our country. hundreds that are now not dammed and protected and tested for water quality because of this wild and scenic rivers. I was just in Oregon, half the state is wild and scenic rivers. In the East Coast, it has a bigger influence in Maine and places, some parts of upstate New York. And then he did National Scenic Trails, Johnson. The Appalachian Trail, Pacific Coast Trail, or whole trail systems, including indigenous communities, cowboy trails, all of this. They create National Historic Preservation Trust. Anytime you see the National Register and a plaque on a building and all of this, they started trying to reclaim the heritage. The Johnsons, they were opposed to, she was particularly livid, Lady Bird, at the Cross Island Expressway because of it thoughtlessly. Eisenhower was an Army logistics engineer guy, and quite brilliantly, we built our interstate highway system, so I celebrate it. And I'm a beneficiary of it. But at the same time, they just ran through neighborhoods. There was no NIMBY group in poor, Storyville, where jazz was born in New Orleans. They just poured the interstate God through, and the same with the Bronx, and it ruined neighborhoods, some of it. So this was happening, and Lady Bird was just saying, whoa, we got to make sure we're not doing the wrecking ball to historic buildings. You have to create trust, and on and on. The Johnson had a lot of help by a lot of senators. I won't get time to mention them. I'll just tell you that he had a good conservation record, ruined, except for a guy like me coming to a town hall in Oyster Bay to praise him, ruined by Vietnam War. It made no sense. You're saving a wild river in Idaho, but you're at the same day you're sending memos to drop Agent Orange to kill the forest of Vietnam. Lyndon and Lady Bird were very American beautification centered. They didn't think of environment in the global terms of the way of